Good evening, everyone. My name is Lonnie Payne, and I will be one of your presenters tonight with Sue Helms. We are UC Master Gardeners from Napa County, and as you can tell, our talk tonight is Save Your Leaves, Save Our Planet, the importance of composting. And what I would like to do now is introduce to you our Napa Library representative, Stephna Premuk, and has a few words to say to you.
Thank you. Many years ago, my husband, a local arborist, he wisely selected an October glory maple tree for our front yard. And the tree, it protects our house from bright sun during those hot summer days. It provides cover for bird life, and we hear bird song in the early morning. In fall, we appreciate the autumnal color, and this variety, it affords us the wonderful bird song in the morning, in the early morning. It also gives us the opportunity in the late spring or the late fall, after we've had a glorious show, of exercise, because there are lots of leaves that are on the ground. They've fallen. So, this tree provides us a lot of joy, and it provides us some work. And these leaves find their way into our compost pile. And they find their way into our pile, and they go, and it allows nature to do its thing. And eventually it becomes our compost that our soil that goes into our vegetable garden or into our borders. So the leaves are a very important part of our structure here at home when it comes to gardening. Most gardening books, many I should say, books on gardening and landscaping, they will touch briefly on the subject of composting. Two books in our collection which delve more into the subject are No Waste Composting, Small Space Waste Recycling Indoors and Out by Michelle Baltz. And then we also have The Compost Specialist, and that has a longer subtitle, The Essential Guide to Creating and Using Garden Compost and Using Potting and Seed Compost. Now, both books, they offer concrete, concise, and easy information on how to start composting. They explain which materials are suitable for composting or mulching, and they provide expert advice on the materials needed and the techniques for developing the organisms for breaking down waste and building beautiful gardening soil. So these are at your library, and I will put them in the chat. So if you're interested, you can take a look at them. But as I said, many of our gardening books will have some information about gardening, about composting, because it is an important component of gardening. All right, Lonnie, back to you.
Great, thank you, Stephna. So, we are UC Master Gardeners of Napa County, and our mission is to extend research-based knowledge and information on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable landscape practices to the residents of California and be guided by our core values and our strategic initiatives. We would like to ask you to help us serve you better. And one way that you can do that is in a couple of weeks, you will be receiving a brief follow-up survey about the talk we're giving tonight. And if you're so inclined, please take a moment to fill out the survey. It's a short survey, and it will give us information that will help us to improve the quality of the programs that we provide to you. Like I said, you'll probably see it in a couple of weeks, and once again, you could ignore it, or you could help us out by filling it out. Thank you. So, what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about what plants do. We're going to talk a little bit about some composting legislation. We're going to talk about what can we do. We're going to talk about the role of composting, and we're going to give you some composting basics. And what we would like to ask you to do is, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And at the end of this talk, we'll come back and see if we've answered your question or whether we need to elaborate more on the questions that you posed for us. I should have been more thoughtful with how I use my leaves. Arg!
I realized when we were getting ready to talking about this topic that I didn't really understand what they were talking about when they talked about keeping carbon in the soil, and I just didn't understand it at all. So this is a very basic explanation. Sun comes down, hits the leaves of a plant. It begins a process called photosynthesis. Plants use carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil to build carbohydrates. As we know, carbohydrates are food, right? Food for us too. So any carbohydrates the plant doesn't need right then. Oh, another part of photosynthesis is a plant makes oxygen, which we certainly like. Anyway, any part of the carbohydrates the plant doesn't need right then, it sends down into the soil and sends it through its roots in a process called exuding. It kind of seeps out of the roots, and then it can feed soil organisms in the roots. And so to continue the cycle, the soil organisms, little micro and macro organisms in the soil, release CO2 through respiration, and then it starts all over again. Plants absorb carbon dioxide and back around. So the carbon dioxide enters from the atmosphere, enters the soil, partially through decomposed plant material on the soil on the top of the soil, or it could be old plants that have died, the roots are in the ground, and the soil organisms that feed on the stuff coming out of the roots. Soils are made in part of broken down plant matter, and this means that they contain a lot of carbon that those plants took in from the atmosphere when they were alive. Soils can store a lot of carbon, especially where it is cold, which is why they're talking about when glaciers are melting. There's a lot of carbon stored in that soil. If carbon is not stored in the soil, it is released into the air as carbon dioxide, which is one of the main greenhouse gases causing climate change. If you are interested in that, at the end of the talk, we have a resource list, and one of the resources that Lonnie will point out is very good from MIT. Talks about this in some detail. It's short, actually. But then it has, would you like more information about climate change? And that to me was just fascinating, because there's parts of it they don't fully understand, and parts of it they certainly can, and they can see the effects. It's very good. So I highly recommend it. Next slide. So California has been working through the legislature to help control climate change. So greenhouse gas emissions can be lowered by increasing the quality and the number of really good community composting services. Can you go back one, Lonnie? Lonnie, we're going forward. Go back. There we go. So they believe that the focus on recycling organic materials is central to California's efforts to combat climate change. I mean, there's other things we need to do, but this is important. Organic materials are a large portion of our waste stream. It's about a third of everything we throw away. And so they passed a law, SB 1383, with a target of 50% reduction in the landfilling of organic waste by 2022. By 2025, that reduction target is 75%. And for people who live in Napa, they might have seen an article recently saying how low everyone was in that target. Next slide. Here is something from the Napa Recycling and Waste Services that services Central Napa and parts of the county, not Upper Valley, not American Canyon. It is a city-owned facility. It processes 170,000 tons per year, which is pretty impressive. They service 35,000 households and 1,500 businesses and schools. And here's the good news. Despite overall in California, the rate being below 50%, and it was supposed to be 50% by 2022, we are at a 68% diversion rate here in Napa. And since our goal is 75% in 2 years in 2025, I think we're going to do well with that. In this picture on the right, you can see factory kind of big machinery. They're adding air to the piles, aerating the piles. But you can see it's quite a big operation, this down near American Canyon. Next slide. Here's one of my favorite pictures. You can see how warm it is, and the person taking a picture is, I just think, kind of nutty for doing that, but I'm sure they're fine. So this just shows you what a big time operation it is. And they make good compost too. There you go. Next. So what impact can I, as one little person, make on limiting climate change? Well, one really important thing you can do is by properly recycling your organic materials, by putting your food waste in the yard waste instead of your garbage can. And I know from my own household that the amount of garbage we generate each week has really dropped since we started putting the organic materials in the yard waste container. The other thing you can do is do home composting, and then the materials never leave your household. You get them, you put them, make a compost pile, and then you can use the compost at your home. It never has to travel anywhere. And now I'm going to turn over to Lonnie.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about compost. What is compost? Compost is a natural process of decomposition. It occurs in nature but can be speeded up with human intervention. The more proper definition is that it's a process in which organic substances are reduced from large volumes of rapidly decomposable materials to small volumes of materials which continue to decompose slowly. Let's talk about the many benefits of compost. Compost reduces landfill waste. Approximately 30% of what is normally sent to landfill is organic material. Compost improves soil structure. It improves the water penetration in the heavy soils. It improves water and nutrient retention in all soils. It improves drainage and aeration in all soils. It nurtures and feeds soil organisms. And it slowly releases nutrients and minerals that plants use. One of the things when I'm talking about this particular slide, I'm reminded of the fact of organic waste going into landfill. And to give you the example that we like to use, if you took a head of lettuce and you just put it in a landfill, it would take almost 20 years for that head of lettuce to decompose in a landfill. Composting is much quicker than 20 years. So if you think about all of the heads of lettuce and other organic materials and just how much slower it takes for them to decompose in a landfill, it's a very powerful reason to try to divert as much organic material away from landfills as possible. So, some uses for compost. Compost is considered a soil conditioner. It improves the tilth. And when we talk about tilth, we're talking about the physical condition of soil, which makes it easier to absorb nutrients and water. You know, compost is very flexible. It can also be used as a soil amendment. You can use it as mulch. You can use it as potting mix. The other thing I like to share about compost is that home compost is completely organic, unlike most commercial soil amendments. So clearly you can see that compost, while it can be used as a general fertilizer, does much more than just feed the plant. What does compost need? Well, you need decomposers, and these are things we're going to talk about in a moment, which break some of the larger pieces of organic matter down to smaller pieces. It needs water. It needs air. It needs food. And I like to also say, if you want to have a quicker way of composting, it needs temperature. Temperature plays a role in getting compost to happen quicker. So I was telling you about those decomposers. What are they? They are macroorganisms. So we're talking worms, we're talking sow bugs, we're talking flies, we're talking snails, beetles, earthworms, anything that's in the compost pile that will break up that organic material into smaller bits. We also have the microorganisms, the bacteria, the fungi, the Actinomycetes, which all work at breaking down those organic materials. I like to say that when we look at the macroorganisms and the microorganisms, think of a kitchen grate. The microorganisms is the coarser side, and then the microorganisms is that fine side of your home grater. So Sue's going to tell you a little bit about the food.
I think the food is the fun part. You get to play around with what you add. It's all going to be organic material. We talk about in composting browns and greens. The browns are carbon-rich material. They're usually dry. It could be dried garden debris like dried leaves. If you have a lawn, your dried grass, dried grass clippings, prunings from when you're pruning your bushes, bark chips. You could have shredded paper, you could have cardboard, you could use straw. And one thing, if you're short on browns, because if you don't have the browns, sometimes it's hard to come up with them, is you can go to the feed store and buy a bag of rice hulls quite inexpensively, the outside of each little piece of rice. And those work terrifically well. Next. The other kind of foods you have are nitrogen-rich materials called greens. They could be obviously green leaves, kitchen waste like you see in the bucket there. Here's where it gets a little confusing. Green grass clippings are greens. If they're dried up, they're browns. Here's where it gets confusing again. Coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are greens because they're high in nitrogen, but they are brown in color. Oh well. Tea bags or tea leaves can go in, fresh garden debris, and fresh or aged herbivore manure, like chickens, rabbits. Do not put animal manure. That would not be good. Next. You're going to chop up your materials for your backyard compost, and you want them, the smaller they are, the quicker they will decompose because more surfaces will be exposed to oxygen. So on the left, you see someone's kitchen scraps, and they put them in a bowl. And then they show here next, they use kitchen shears. A lot of times I'll use a chopping cleaver to chop mine up. But you want to get them down to about a 1/2 inch to maybe 1.5 inches big, and on the right is very nicely chopped up. Kitchen scraps ready for a compost pile. I am not always that good at getting them really small, but that means that I sometimes have to compost them longer because of that. Next. Here's what not to add to your compost pile. If you add meat or fish products, dairy products, or fats or oils, you might well attract rodents, which I probably think you don't want to do. Don't add soil. Soil is already gone through the composting process, so it's not going to add anything. And people have sometimes said to me, but you need the soil to start the process. I promise you, you do not. The microorganisms will appear. It will happen. The earthworms will come. They just do that. You don't want to add weed seeds because most people's piles will not be hot enough to break them down. And that's a really great use of your yard waste bin. And you don't want to add meat-eating animal manure. There could be pathogens in it. That's why you don't want to do it. Another thing you don't want to add are plants that are diseased, because once again, your pile will not be getting hot enough at home. Unlike the big compost pile down that the recycling people have. So you don't want to add that to your pile as well. Next. Here's kind of a laundry list of some of the many ways of composting. The first one is worm composting, and it is terrific, but it is different, and worms don't really like the dry leaves that much. And we're not talking about it tonight. We will be having a workshop, which Lonnie will mention at the end of the talk, on September 16th here in Napa. We'll have one part of it being backyard composting and in more detail than what we're doing here. And one part of it will be worm composting. And he will give you more information about that later, but we're not going to talk about it tonight. Then other ones we will be talking about tonight are lasagna or sheet composting. The other ones are all relating to temperature. Cool or no fuss composting. Temperature is right in the title. One subset of that is leaf composting, which fits with tonight's talk. Warm composting is probably the most popular and is a combination of cool and rapid or hot composting. And finally, we have rapid or hot composting. So, next slide. There are many names for this, but lasagna or sheet composting are kind of some of the two most common names, and it kind of covers a variety of processes. It's where you make layers like in lasagna. Think of that. So it is great for conditioning large areas of either cultivated, like your old lawn, or uncultivated soil for future planting. If it was an old lawn, the first thing you're going to do is cut it as short as you can. You do not have to dig up the lawn. It will break down. You're going to wet the soil first and then moisten each layer as it's applied. You're going to cover the ground with alternating layers of newspaper. The newspaper you would have damp, and you probably have to do about 4 or 5 thicknesses to make it really work. And or cardboard. I prefer the cardboard because it's easier. Things aren't blowing all around. Then you could do a layer of grass clipping, and then maybe a layer of greens, and then maybe a layer of kitchen scraps, maybe if you have a lot, etc. You just keep building layers of browns and greens, not too thick for each layers. And when the materials have broken down, especially if you start with cardboard, when you can get something, you can even poke a hole to make a plant. But when that bottom layer is soft enough that you could easily poke a hole through it, that's when you can start planting in your lasagna or sheet composted area. Next. Now, this is a picture, and go back one, please. Thank you. And it is completely negating what I just said. There is an alternate way of lasagna or sheet composting. This was for a very large lawn and used appliance cardboard. And I don't think you can see, I used some of the landscape staples to hold things around because things started moving around. And then I purchased compost from the city. I wanted to transform an old lawn into a garden space. And so that's what this is showing. The spray painted lines was because someone was helping me move the dirt and they were unclear as to where I wanted it. So it just seemed like it made it easier if I spray painted lines for them. Next. This is it at the end, and the beds look rather small, but actually the rice straw that I put as a walkway kind of, when you peeled it off the bale, it was kind of that wide, but it kind of smushed down to the real pathways pretty quickly. And I have to say, I'll say it right here, that this year, one of these rows, one of the ones on the ends got kind of garbled as to where exactly it was supposed to be. And I did this 4 years ago, and I have to tell you, it was very clear where the compost had been put 4 years ago. And I've put a little bit more compost since then, but not very much at all. A shovel told me very quickly, I have good old Napa clay soil. And if I put it in the pathway part, the shovel would go clunk, 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 clunk. And if I put it where the compost had been, it sunk. And it was really easy to figure out where I wanted the bed to be. So it really does make a huge difference in your soil. You could do this with layers of stuff. I just didn't have enough stuff to do the layers with. The other thing I'll say about lasagna or sheet composting, it is great to do it when you want to revitalize a raised bed that you have. You know how the soil kind of gets used up by the plants, kind of gets lower in the box. You can do lasagna or sheet composting in that, and it's terrific. And that's where I would layer stuff. And I did that. I've done that before, and I thought it was really effective. Next. The next ones are the temperature composts. Cooler, no fuss composting, we say compost happens. It can take 1 to 2 years to complete. You can continually add organic matter as you get it, but I was thinking about this earlier today and realized I did a compost pile a really long time ago. Someone gave it to me and I didn't really know what I was doing. I knew kind of about the layers and I just forgot about it. And you know what? It still composted eventually. It just took much longer. You don't have to worry about controlling it or monitoring it. The bad news is that it does not kill weed seeds or any seeds for that matter. There's nothing better than putting a cantaloupe in your compost pile and then having many baby cantaloupe plants. Maybe you want that, but maybe you don't. And it does not kill pathogens. Cool or no fuss composting is done by your decomposers. Next. A subset of the cool compost is when you take dried leaves. And this is kind of why we wanted to talk about this right now. This is a great time to start thinking, as Stephanie said, about the leaves that you maybe could be gathering once they fall off the trees. I store my leaves. I keep them in a galvanized garbage can. They stay great. Put a lid on, it's perfect. I use them in my compost building during the year. Then I'll have to worry about, do I have the right dry stuff? Do I want to shred up papers? I don't always want to do that. Next. There's another very easy method of leaf composting. See, get a general idea of what they're doing here. Next slide, please. It's really easy to do. You make a cage. They had just taken some sort of wire mesh and they had string tying it together.
Wait, I keep
So you construct your cage, put in the leaves and forget about it. Since you're only using leaves, it is not as nutrient rich as other types of composting. If you wanted to add some greens to it, you can increase the amounts of nutrients in your final compost, and then really it just becomes regular old cool or no fuss composting. And I love it. A lot of places they call this, when it's just leaves put out, it's called leaf mold, which I love. And people talk about what it's great compost and great mulch it is. Next, warm compost is probably the most popular way of composting. There's more control and more monitoring. You can, or don't have to, add new organic material. The pile will get warm. You can put your hand in it. You can feel it getting warm. You can turn the pile occasionally. You can use like a pitchfork or a garden fork or something like that. The decomposers are at work. It takes 3 months to 1 year to complete. And once again, it will not kill seeds or many pathogens. And I kind of think about this one kind of like making a soup. You could add something partway through. That's fine. It'll still keep working. Next. Okay, rapid or hot composting. UC recommends this method. It's very controlled and monitoring. You're going to do roughly, okay, if you look up how much browns and greens should you put in a hot compost pile, you'll find every statistic under the sun. Equal volumes, I've seen 2/3 browns because they're lighter and 1/3 greens. I've even seen people working out how much carbon and how much nitrogen is in each material and working it all out. But I read this one thing and it was done by a reputable source. And then they said, but really, why do you want to bother with that? It's all going to work. So roughly equal volumes, maybe a little more browns than greens to fill your bin in thin layers. You get everything damp. Oh, the moisture content of your compost pile, especially for any of them, should feel like a damp sponge. So if you picked it up, you know how damp sponges aren't dripping, but they are noticeably damp. You're going to turn every 3 to 5 days as the pile cools. And I have a compost thermometer right here that is you don't completely need it, but it's kind of helpful for the hot compost. This will kill many pathogens and seeds, and you can have complete decomposition between 3 and 8 weeks. And I did not believe it, so I did a pile last year. I did 2 ways, one with just pallets zip tied together, and one in just one of the yard compost bins that if you come to our workshop on the 16th, you could get one of these bins for a very inexpensive price from the city. I spent a month and I went out every few days and turned it. Within 2 days, my pile was up to 140 degrees, which is great. It got up to 160 degrees, which is terrific because that's the temperature that will kill your seeds, your weed seeds. And I spent about a month doing it, and then I let it sit for a long time, and I had very nice compost at the end of it. Next. So when you build a pile, ideally, you have a pile roughly 3 by 3 by 3. You have small particle size, 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches. The moisture content is like a wrung out sponge. If it's too dry, it's not going to compost very quickly. If it's too wet, it gets stinky and will not generate the needed heat. You need to turn the pile to get oxygen into it. And here's an interesting fact. At 155 degrees, matter will decompose twice as fast as at 130. So it's not too hard to get a pile to 130. It certainly isn't hard to get a pile to 110. But 155 will decompose twice as fast as at 130. It's pretty impressive. Next. Here is a picture of a backyard compost bin. What's slightly deceptive about this one, it actually comes apart. This comes apart in 2 pieces, and there's one more piece, so it's actually taller. It is not 3 by 3. It's like 2 by 3 by 3 by 2 feet tall. But these work great. Little covering so it's not getting rain soaked. And what that is one thing about leaf composting that I know some people just throw a tarp loosely over the top just so it doesn't get completely soggy. Next. Here's another compost bin, which is much smaller. It's a small tumbler and it's maybe about 3 feet wide, but it's divided in half. And someone lent one to me and I was using it and I didn't think it would do anything. And it didn't do it very quickly, but it does break down. And these are great if you don't have a lot of compost and you don't really want to go out in your yard when the weather isn't great. You can have this just near your back door, and it's really easy to put stuff in, maybe throw a little water in, give it a quick spin, and you're done. So it's pretty terrific. Next.
On the tree.
No, you're fine.
So if you're having problems with your compost, if it's not composting, it's probably not got enough oxygen. It might have too much brown stuff and it might be too dry. If your pile smells, it could be too wet and maybe someone threw some meat, grease, cheese, dairy, whatever into your pile. If you are having critters come, you might have put in meat or grease. If you add food waste, you should try to put it in the middle of the pile because then it's not just out there being advertised to animals. The other thing is, if you're concerned about animals, especially those of digging variety like gophers, you can put some hardware cloth underneath your compost pile and that just kind of stops them. They don't really want to bother with it. Next, Lonnie.
Well, so we really want to thank you guys for letting us tell you a little bit about what we can do as citizens of Napa County and really citizens of the world to delay or decrease the harm that's being done by global warming or climate change, whichever word you want to use for that. And compost really is a great tool. When you think about compost, what is loaded with nutrients, it's packed with fiber, it helps retain moisture, and it makes soil healthier. And that's compost. Whether you do it in a leaf compost, whether you do the hot compost, any type of compost you do ultimately helps our environment. So, we're just happy that people are embracing composting, and we're so happy that you guys want to listen to this conversation this evening.
Yeah.
Coming up, we have 2 events we want to highlight. On September 16th, at our UC Cooperative Extension over on Sosco, we are having a backyard and worm composting workshop. It's free. It's from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m., and we're going to do both backyard and worm composting. If you sign up and want to attend, you get to decide whether you want to do the backyard or worm composting. If you do the backyard composting, you have an opportunity to buy one of those compost bins that Sue was talking about for around $20. If you decide you want to do the worm composting, you leave free with a composting bin made just for worm composting, and you also leave with worms. In addition to, there will be demos on how to construct the worm composting and also demos on how to construct your backyard composting. That's September 16th. At the end of the month, September 30th, from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m., the UC Master Gardeners of Napa County are having our fall fair. And we've done 2 of these in past years, and it's well received. It is something that whether you are a gardener or whether you're curious about horticulture or whether you want to do something with your kids. There's a little bit of everything at our Master Gardening Fall Fair. It's a big science fair if you want to think of it from that perspective. Again, it's September 30th, and I put the QR codes for both, so in case you wanted to get additional information, you could just get your little smartphone and zap on it, and bring you to those two particular sites. Sue was talking about, I'm going to just briefly tell you some of the references we use, and these links like Cal Recycling and the EPA's website, and Sue mentioned the MIT website that we got some of our information from. That is a great URL to click on, because not only does it talk about soil-based carbon sequestration, it also gives you a primer. So you can go in there and it gives you just a lot of really good information in a manner that's easy to understand. We also, because we've been doing these compost talks and workshops for a couple of years, these are some of the resources that we use when we were constructing this talk. And once again, you can click on any of these and you can get additional information. So now we're going to open it up for questions.
Okay, hold on for just a second.
Okay.
And we're going to give you some. The first one is from Penny, and she says, when you are pulling up vegetable gardens, after you're done with your garden, should you leave the roots in the ground? Does it help the soil?
Oh, I like that one. There's quite a big movement for no-till, and that helps keep carbon in the soil, but that's not the only reason. It makes for the microorganisms in the soil make a great community and climate, and it's great. So yes, it is hard to do. The only thing I wouldn't do is I wouldn't leave tomatoes in the soil, because sometimes they get some funny little diseases. And if you keep planting tomatoes in the same place, you can have problems with that. I would maybe take out my tomatoes, but I've done it with greens that I've grown, and it's very hard to do. It goes against everything you've ever learned, but it's great to do. And the roots in the soil will decompose in the soil, and it's just great all around.
Okay, that makes sense. Penny also says, you know, when you were, Sue, when you were talking about chopping things up for the compost pile, Penny says, if one is lazy and does not wish to chop, will stuff still compost?
Yes, because I did a pile and I didn't chop things up fine. Yeah, it will. It just takes longer.
It just takes a long time.
And sometimes when your compost is, you think it's done and you want to use it, you will find chunks of stuff and you just throw it back in your compost pile.
Yeah, and if I can also piggyback on that, so when you use, a lot of us have different types of compost bins in our yard, and some of us are lazy, and so when we get our container out of the kitchen that we've used all of our vegetables and stuff, that maybe we didn't chop up, and we just take them out and dump them into our composter out in the yard. Will composition happen? Absolutely. The key, though, is that you're putting bigger pieces. Remember when in the earlier part of the talk, I talked about those decomposers, you know, the snails, the slugs, the worms. They break down that big matter. It just takes them a little bit longer. So absolutely, you can do it without breaking things up.
Okay, so, and Sue, I think this question came in just as you were addressing it in your talk, but what temperature do you really want to aim for with hot composting?
If you get it, oh gosh, you know what, to be perfectly honest, I know that this is on some of our resources that are linked. You getting it up to 165 is great for a short period of time because it will kill your weed seeds and some of the pathogens. Hopefully you haven't put a bunch of really diseased material in there. Oh, the other thing you don't want to put in your compost bin, I forgot to say this, are rose clippings. Those thorns will not break down. And sometimes roses have diseases like blights and stuff. Throw that stuff in your yard waste bin. They can take care of it.
Okay.
So 165 is great, but you want to get it up, like, it doesn't have to be that hot for long. Oh, the other thing is you don't want to keep adding green stuff to it to make it hotter and hotter and hotter. There are many tales of smoking compost piles because like people added like alfalfa pellets, like animal feed, and just added too much. So you do want to kind of keep an eye on the temperature, and they do get hot enough you wouldn't want to stick your hand in it probably. So that's when a thermometer gets pretty helpful.
And
Okay.
if I can also add, piggyback on what Sue was saying, when we do the bigger compost talk, we really go into a more detailed conversation about the different types of temperatures, because different bacteria work best with different levels of heat. And when Sue mentioned the 160, that's a good benchmark. There's a whole group of bacteria called thermophiles, and they work best like from 140 degrees up to 200. The problem is, if you get your pile up to 200, you're killing everything. So no one really tries to get a hot compost that high. So when Sue mentioned the 160, that's a good goal to go for. But anything above 140, we kind of consider it in the hot composting range.
Okay. Mitzi asked an interesting question. She asks, will leaf composting change the soil pH if you spread it on top of a bed as mulch?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
How's that for an answer?
I think it might depend on what leaves you
Yeah.
were using.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay, and then Christine says, do you keep the bin in sun or shade?
That's one of those depends. That depends. If you are under scorching sun, you probably want to check it to be sure that it doesn't dry out. And you might, if you keep it under constant sun, you might want to have a thermometer just to monitor. Because if it gets too hot, you can always cool it down with putting some water, just a little bit maybe. But I have one that gets about, one of my bins gets about 8 hours of sun a day. I have another one that's in the shade, and they both work. So it's one of those depends questions. You just want to monitor. You want to look in there, and if it's too hot to touch, you know it's too hot. Or Sue, how did you say that? You said that a different way, but.
Well, I would just say that I have one that's in the sun all the time, and I have a couple under fruit trees. And I mean, I'm not really worried about how quickly they work. If my compost pile was somewhere where it was going to be damp all the time, that's not going to work. Where it's cold a lot, but it didn't get any sun, probably not going to work as well as you would like. That's all.
Okay. Okay, so here's one. How do you manage house flies in the compost? Are they good for the process?
I think if you bury your food waste and aren't putting meat and grease and dairy, you should not have that much problems. You might get fruit flies, but if you do layers of brown and green, it should be okay.
And
All
I'll go one step further and say that I use what we call one of those Darth Vader plastic bins, and I never have a problem with flies in my compost bin outdoors. And I've been doing this for quite a few years now, and I don't have a problem with the flies there.
I think if you put food out on the top of the pile, you might attract something.
Well, you're asking for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Gina wants to know, are there certain types of leaves that are best for composting, like oak versus maple versus fruit trees?
That's another one of those, I feel, depend questions. I mean, everything decomposes. And we know that if you're just doing leaves as your primary food, you aren't adding any extra nutrients to that particular amount of compost. I know there are some people that say some types of leaves don't do well, but we haven't seen any really science that said one leaf is better. I mean, there might be if you are more inclined to the chemical makeup of some of the leaves, you might be able to find out that maybe there's some leaves you want to use to provide a certain nutrient. But just in general, that's not. I don't really have an answer. That it depends.
Okay. Well, there's a follow-up question from Mitzi saying, what about if the leaves are oak leaves? Would you spread that leaf mulch like on olive tree beds? So I'm just adding that in case either one of you want to chime in. Are you going to leave it as it depends?
Yeah, I have to say, underneath my oak trees, I have like leaf mold because I don't rake up the leaves, and it's quite nice.
Okay.
It's hard to know whether it would be good for olive tree. I don't really know. It could be a good experiment.
All right.
Back to the question that somebody had on the pH, or the change of the pH of if using leaf compost. Most finished composts are about neutral pH within a range of 6 to 8. However, the initial pH of home compost made with a usual mixture of vegetable and food trimmings and other household compostable material is likely to be between 5 and 7. So based on that, if the leaf compost is completely finished composting and you use it in your bed, it should be a pH within 6 to 8.
Okay.
Great.
Cindy wants to know if a worm bin can be in the sun.
You're just both pretty. And that's why we're not going into the world of worms today. But just to briefly say, if you get them too hot, they will cook.
Worms like it cool, Cindy.
Yeah.
I have one real shady corner in my yard, and I have my worm bins in my corner. And they seem to do just fine.
Yeah, and I have my worm bin under my carport.
All right.
So they don't like to get too hot.
Yeah.
We are going to have on the 16th a full, we're going to have our worm guru, Penny Paul, who might be on this call.
Well, Penny just chimed in on the chat saying, no, not in the sun. There you have it. No. Okay, we have one last question, and it's kind of a follow-up. We were talking about what types of leaves are best, or maybe we shouldn't use. Heather said, what about black walnut? It's known to produce a compound that can inhibit the growth of some plants, and that seems bad for a garden. So
yeah, when that question was asked, I thought, ooh, black walnut. I know that I kind of always thought it came from the roots, but I wouldn't use black walnut leaves. If you didn't want things to grow, they might be perfect.
Yeah, but probably not your best leaf choice.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, you guys, I think that's it for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And so just in closing, and guys, thank you so much. Those are very interesting questions, and Sue and I love questions like that. So in closing, just want to let you know that you can find this slideshow and further resources on our website, which is UC Master Gardeners of Napa County. And we have the URL there. And if you go to that website, this is what you'll see. Here's our home page. And if you follow the arrow, which is here, down to the bottom, it would get to a box that says past programs and events. If you click on that, and I'd say give it about 3 to 5 days, this whole talk will be on that, in that particular grouping. And so, for example, the references and resources that we showed, if you didn't write them down, you can get them there. So, and not only that, but this page tells you a lot of the stuff that we're doing, tells you about all of the different types of programs we're doing. It tells you about our information desk. So this is a great resource that you can go to, and it's very easy to find. And you know what? Even if you forget the URL, just go up into a search engine and do Napa MG, Napa Master Gardener, and it's going to bring you up to a location that brings you to our homepage. So there's so many ways to find our homepage. And with that, I hope this was helpful to a lot of you. I hope you either heard something new or something that makes you now want to go and explore. Have a great night.